Monday at noon, the 23rd, Pavel Marzau, who's chair of the Congress of the new Belarusian diaspora of Europe and the United States, will speak on samizdat and satiric media in Belarus. On Monday, November 30th, William Butler, who is a professor of law at the Dickinson School of Law at Penn State, taught for a long time in London, will be speaking on pending civil law reform in Russia. And then in December, we have a number of events, including on December 1st, an evening film screening of a new film about Anna Akhmatova. Olga Vedina, who is the Galina Starovoitova Fellow on Human Rights and Conflict Resolution, will speak on migrants in Moscow. And Dick Miles, a former U.S. ambassador to several countries, but he's appearing after having just returned from serving in Turkmenistan, will speak on U.S.-Turkmen relations. And then on Monday, December 14th at noon, Rock Brenner from Marist College will speak about Russia and the Pacific. Well, this is a special event for a number of reasons. Nicholas Thompson has written a very well-received book. It would be worthwhile from that point of view alone. He's senior editor at Wired magazine, and the book is The Hawk and the Dove, Paul Nitze, George Kennan, The History of the Cold War. One of the reasons why it's well received is he has his own special take on this relationship because he is Paul Nitze's grandson. He's also a fellow at the New America Foundation, a regular contributor on CNN. It's rare these days that a book on U.S.-Russian relations gets the kind of media play that this book has gotten. And I want to say it undoubtedly is in part because of the family connection, but it's really heartening because it's a book that should get this kind of media play. Maybe he'll talk about this, but he's been on a number of talk shows with more to come, including, I guess, Glenn Beck, and he was on with Gordon Liddy earlier today. So it's a book which has captured a wide range of attention from this audience to the TV talk show circuit, and I hope that by the time we get to an hour from now, you'll understand why. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. It's obviously it's an honor to be here and to be here at an institute that one of my two protagonists cared so deeply about. I should also add that my grandfather is Paul Nitze. At one of the last talks I gave, somebody walked out because they thought they were here to see Nietzsche's grandson. So if there had been any confusion, you may feel free to leave, and I will not take offense. This book comes out of two moments. The first was in 1999, and my grandfather, who's the hawk, he's the guy sort of staring ominously with a cigarette in his mouth on the cover. Kennan is the man sitting cheerfully, is the dove. My grandfather spent his whole life arguing that the United States needed a larger nuclear arsenal. If we were behind the Soviets, we needed to catch up. If we were even, we needed to be ahead. If we were ahead, we needed to be really far ahead. So it's the same, use the metaphor of a track coach who, when the runner is behind, says, speed up. And when he's ahead, speed up. That's my grandfather's philosophy throughout the Cold War. And then in 1999, he's had a gradual evolution, and he comes full circle. And he says, actually, slow down. In fact, stop. He says we should get rid of all of our nuclear weapons. And he writes an op-ed in the New York Times to that effect. He's 92 years old. It's really his last public statement. And I was at his house maybe a week later, maybe 2 weeks later, and he gets a letter from George Kennan, and he reads it out loud at dinner. And it's a beautiful, elegant letter. I mean, most of you here are probably familiar with Kennan's writing, but he's an astonishing writer. And the letter says something like, Dear Paul, I read your op-ed in the New York Times today. I agree with every word. Isn't it amazing that we find ourselves in accord after 50 years on matters that have meant so much to us in times gone by? And when my grandfather read that letter, I thought, wow, there's something interesting about this relationship. There's something there. And I talked to my grandfather a little bit about him, the only conversation I ever had with him about Kennan. Then 5 years later, my grandfather dies, followed a few months later by Kennan's death. They're a little bit like Jefferson and Adams. And I remember reading the circumstance of their death are a little like Jefferson and Adams. And I remember reading Kennan's obituary and suddenly realizing how closely his life paralleled my grandfather's. And I was at my father's house, and my father said, you know that Kennan came to your mother and mine's wedding? And then I realized not just are they have these incredibly parallel lives, but there was a real friendship. They weren't best of friends, but there's a connection between the two of them. So that was when this project started. The idea of the book, and the idea of the book from the very beginning, was to tell a personality-driven history of the Cold War. Not most histories of the Cold War are episodic, right? Here's the Berlin Airlift, here's the Vietnam War, here's the Korean War, and you move from episode to episode. And I wanted to try to tell it through people, and to tell it in a visual way, based on scenes, based on these two characters. So that's the goal of the book, and it goes from 1945 to 1990, and it starts in May of 1945. So the Cold War, so the World War II has just ended. The United States and Germany, and the United States and Russia have defeated Germany, and there's a celebration in Red Square. And Kennan is the ranking American in the American embassy, and people are out front, and they're celebrating, and they're screaming, and they're saying, God bless America, and thank you, America, for helping us through this and helping us win. And Kennan, he'd lived in Moscow during the purges. He understands that Stalin is not the best ally for the United States. He understands that there's some problems with this relationship. And so you get the sense that he's looking down on the crowd with a little bit of pity and confusion, and not only about what he should do. He's a very shy man. He doesn't want to go out and be hoisted in the air, he writes. He doesn't want to be carried on people's shoulders in the crowd. And he's not sure what to do. And his 8-year-old daughter, who's here in the front row, is there throwing candy at the people in Red Square who are celebrating. And so the story starts with Kennan trying to decide, what should I do? What should I do at this moment? And he steps outside and says, all honor to the Soviet allies, and then steps back inside. My grandfather, Paul Nitze, at the very same time, he's in Germany, and his job is he speaks German, is to find the former Nazi leaders and to interrogate them. So he starts to, right at that very moment, he's interviewing Albert Speer, learn about the bombing strategy, learn why this bombing run worked and this bombing run didn't work. And then he's sent to Hiroshima. And his job, he lands there right after the atomic bombs had hit. And his job is to figure out what buildings fell, what buildings didn't fall, what can we learn about civil defense. And it begins this lifelong investigation of what nuclear weaponry means, how you can survive it, how you should build your arsenal. So they both begin the Cold War, the end of the World War II, which is really the beginning of the Cold War, in very interesting points. So I think I'm going to read a passage here because this will get us into the next step of the story. This is about the moment where George Kennan moves from being a second-tier writer in American diplomacy who writes these wonderful essays that nobody reads to being the man who everybody reads. This is February 1946. Stalin has just given a speech at the Bolshoi Theater, and it's a very aggressive speech. It's a very ominous speech about 5-year plans and conflicts with America. And the embassy sends back to Kennan and says, why did Stalin give this speech? And Kennan says, I've been telling you for a long time why Stalin gave this speech, but I'll tell you again. And this is what happens. Martha Mottner was working the late shift in the American Embassy code room in Moscow on Friday, February 22nd, 1946. It was a bare, austere place filled with machinery. Polyfilm covered the windows, creating a low-tech defense against Soviet espionage. The clock struck 5, 6. Mottner's shift was almost over. She was thinking about her date that evening with a young, handsome Swedish diplomat. The two planned to meet up and head to a dance party. Uncertain he was the right man for her, she knew she could find another if things did not work out. Beautiful, young, smart, and working in a diplomatic corps where men vastly outnumbered women, Mottner could pretty much take her pick. It was nearly 7. Mottner was ready to bolt when the tall figure of George Kennan appeared at the code room door. A cold, sinus problems, fever, toothache had laid him up for the past several days. He had last been seen upstairs dictating to his secretary from a couch. But now he was standing before Mottner, holding a thick stack of white papers. He had an important and urgent telegram. It had to go to America, and it had to go now. He handed the stack to Mottner and told her to type it in. She looked with frustration at the first page and its ominous opening sentence. Answer to Departments 284 involves questions so intricate, so delicate, so strange to our form of thought, and so important to our analysis of international environment that I cannot compress answers into a single brief message without yielding to what I feel would be a dangerous degree of oversimplification. For 3 years, Kennan had sent telegrams warning of Moscow's hostility. He had been lambasting, haranguing, cajoling, arguing, pontificating. But each memo describing Stalinist malfeasance had slipped into the quiet river of unread documents flowing through Washington. Now Kennan's masters had asked him to let loose. He had obliged. His work combined the weight and breadth of an essay with the clipped urgency of a telegram. He wanted it sent. Montner respected and liked Kennan, but she was also a little bored by him. Besides, she had a date to get to, and sending this document would take hours. She gave it a quick scan, got the gist of it, and handed it back. Does it really have to go out tonight? You've said all this before. Kennan insisted. Maybe the message was not new, but this version was important. Most likely no one would read it, and most likely anyone who did would not care. But Kennan had poured into it his anger, his wisdom, and his knowledge of history. He would be damned if this chipper young woman with her Swedish paramour would come between his 5,300 words in Washington. They've asked for it, he said, and now they're going to get it. So that's the long telegram, and that's the document that lays out the foundation of Kennan's view of containment, and is the beginning of America recognizing that Stalin is not an appropriate ally. And one of the joys of this project was the opportunity to go back and talk to all these people and try to find people who are involved with Kennan, find people who are involved with Nitze, figure out ways to make these scenes come to life. And for a long time, I kept trying to find people who would have known Kennan at the time of the long telegram, people who were alive then or worked in the embassy, and talked to a few, but they were too old or didn't remember anything. Or a lot of times you'll talk to somebody and before the interview they'll just have read the books about the period and they'll sort of tell you the same stories that you've heard before. But then I found Montner and walk into her living room and, Miss Montner, do you remember anything about the long telegram? Well, yes, I tried to stop it. It was just a great moment. All right, so the long telegram goes out. Everybody in Washington reads it. James Forrestal sees it, passes it around. Kennan suddenly becomes the man who understands Russia. You read the telegram again, and it's clear that this is a man with a profound understanding of Russian history and Russian culture. Kennan is summoned back. He's soon made head of the policy planning staff. He writes his famous X article laying out the notion that we need to contain the Soviet Union. We don't need to roll it back. We just need to box it in, and eventually it will collapse under its own weight. And he becomes an extremely important person in Washington. Many of the important policy achievements in the early Truman administration, or 45 to 49, are the work of George Kennan. And Paul Nitze, meanwhile, takes a little longer. He's not as good a writer as Kennan. He doesn't have as fast an ascent. But he gradually, works his way up. He works on the Marshall Plan. Kennan helps conceptualize how the Marshall Plan should work. Nitze sits in front of Congress and explains why we need to send beats and pulses to Austria, or why we need to send this many. He's a numbers man. He's a guy who's going to do all the work. Kennan has the big ideas. Nitze implements them. Finally, in 1948, he and Kennan start to work together a little bit on Germany. 49, Nitze is brought in as Kennan's deputy to the policy planning staff. So now, for a brief window, American foreign policy is guided by head of the policy planning staff, George Kennan, deputy Paul Nitze. They get along quite well, and they seem to agree, and they see eye to eye. And then everything switches in the summer, early fall of 49. And that's when the Soviet Union sets off an atomic bomb. So suddenly America no longer has a nuclear monopoly, and Truman doesn't know what to do. So Truman sets up a committee, and Acheson is the key member on the committee, Secretary of State Dean Acheson. Acheson says, I don't know what to do. Should we build a hydrogen bomb in response to the Soviets setting off this nuclear bomb? He says, Nitze and Kennan, tell me what you think. So that fall is one of the crucial moments in the book, because two things happen. First, Nitze and Kennan set the bureaucratic patterns they'll follow for the rest of their life, and they set the political patterns they'll follow for the rest of their life. So Kennan responds. He says, okay, this is one of the most important questions I've ever been asked. And he sort of digs into his office, and he goes and he sort of isolates himself, and he writes this beautiful 79-page essay which anticipates so much of the arms race. Right? If we build a hydrogen bomb, then the Soviets will follow, and then we will respond, and they will respond to that, and eventually there will be a nuclear arms race which will become all-consuming, and a financial drain, and it will take away our ability to think rationally about foreign policy because we'll be so obsessed with these weapons. And it quotes St. Paul, and it quotes Shakespeare, and it's marvelous, but it's also completely useless because they need to make a quick decision, and no one is going to read a 79-page memo. Truman makes the decision at a famous meeting which lasts 7 minutes. It's very hard to absorb a 79-page paper with St. Paul quoted in 7 minutes. So this is, in ways, it's Kennan's ultimate brilliance, but also his failure, because he doesn't respond to the task at hand in a way that will actually change policy. He does it in a way that is right and that is good, but it doesn't work. Nitze, meanwhile, is a much simpler syllogism, which is, if the Soviet Union builds a hydrogen bomb, or first step A, is the Soviet Union going to try to build a hydrogen bomb? Why, yes, they are. If they succeed, will we be in a worse position if we don't have one? Why, yes, we will. Therefore, we should build one. It's very simple. And he goes and he talks to people. He joins committees. He tries to kick his enemies out of committees. He brings in Edward Teller, tries to push away Robert Oppenheimer. Eventually has all sorts of influence. He has a real effect on Acheson. Acheson sides with Nitze, helps persuade Truman, and presto. The decision is made. We're going to build a hydrogen bomb. So that's where Nitze becomes, starts to become the master bureaucrat, the man who, will know how to manipulate the system, the man who will work inside. And Kennan becomes the brilliant outsider. And that is the way they will spend the next 40 years. Nitze will go on and he will, he'll serve every president from Roosevelt to Bush. He will become the highest ranking position, Deputy Secretary of Defense. He'll be Reagan's chief arms negotiator, one of the top SALT negotiator. He's always in the game. And Kennan, for the rest of his time, will become the brilliant intellectual outsider. All right, so the next thing I want to read, this is here at the Kennan Institute. I just want to read a passage that some of you will be familiar with. It's one of my favorite passages, both because it shows Kennan's ability as a writer and his, Kennan is extremely optimistic for a brief window about America's capacity to do good in the world and America's capacity to act effectively. And it happens to overlap with when he has maximum power. This is true of both Nitze and Kennan. When they're in power, the American government can do very good things. And when they're out of power, the American government is beset by fools and will only make mistakes. And so Kennan leaves in 1949. He comes back briefly. And then he gives a series of lectures in 1951. And this is from one of those lectures. I sometimes wonder whether, in this respect, the United States is not uncomfortably similar to one of those prehistoric monsters, with a body as long as this room and a brain the size of a pin. He lies there in his uncomfortable primeval mud and pays little attention to his environment. He is slow to wrath. In fact, you practically have to whack his tail off to make him aware that his interests are being disturbed. But once he grasps this, he lays about him in such blind determination that he not only destroys his adversary, but largely wrecks his native habitat. So that's this is the beginning of Kennan's political philosophy of realism, which is the sense that, for the most part, when America acts in the world, it will cause problems and it will fail. We are unlikely to do good. We do not understand the world well enough. The way Congress operates in such a way that it will consistently undermine sound and rational foreign policy. Therefore, the proper response is to step back. Occasionally, he's not an isolationist, but he's a pessimist about our capacity to change things in the direction we want to change them. And it's an instinct that will serve him right on many occasions. Okay, so this is the early 1950s. Both Kennan and Nitze want to have jobs in the Eisenhower administration. Both of them bollocks it. Kennan and Eisenhower campaigns on rollback. Kennan gives a speech in a week before the inauguration about the foolishness of rollback. Despite still wanting a job. And I found Kennan's FBI file, and there's a wonderful note from J. Edgar Hoover saying, on top of the speech, Mr. Kennan would apparently have murdered himself politically, which indeed he did. He did not get a job, or was sort of pushed out by Dulles and Eisenhower. Nitze, too, is pushed out for being too soft, not so much because of his policies, but because he's a Harvard graduate who wears a bow tie and worked for Dean Acheson, and the McCarthy wing of the Republican Party doesn't like this, and he's forced out of the Eisenhower administration. So Kennan goes off, writes these wonderful books, wins Pulitzer Prizes for the rest of the Eisenhower administration. Nitze decides the only honorable thing to do is to try to undermine the Eisenhower administration. So spends the next 7 years fighting them, writing task reports, leaking those task reports. Kennedy comes in. Nitze is one of his top advisors, advises him during the campaign. Kennedy is elected. Nitze thinks he has a shot at a great job. Kennedy calls him up. Mr. Nitze, I've got 3 jobs for you. Pick one. Deputy Secretary of Defense, Undersecretary of State, National Security Advisor. How long do I have? 30 seconds. Deputy Secretary of Defense. And in his memoirs, he writes how proud he was that he made the decision in 30 seconds. Unfortunately, the job is withdrawn as, inaugurations, transitions, complicated times. McNamara comes in. He doesn't want Nitze. My grandfather calls Kennedy back. Hey, excuse me, what about those other 2 jobs? Sorry, you lost your chance. So my grandfather goes into the Kennedy administration. It's sort of a third-tier job in the Defense Department. As is always his career, he works his way back up, gets pushed down, works his way back up. Kennan is on the outside. He's still writing his thinking. He comes back in the public stage in a big way during the beginning of in '66. Gives congressional testimony over the Vietnam War, and it's incredibly prescient and wise. And he understands foreign policy and the connections between countries in a way that almost nobody does. And he sees from the very beginning that the North Vietnamese are not communists. I mean, they are communists, but they're really nationalists. And that this is not a problem of an international, communist conspiracy. This is a problem of a nationalist movement in Vietnam. And that's some value in that, but there's more of a value in disengaging. He gives congressional testimony that people stand up, and he gets thousands and thousands of letters from all these people. It's, the first man. And he's a critic of the Vietnam War. And what's very important here is he's a critic of the Vietnam War who doesn't have long hair and isn't, smoking pot out of Congress. He's, dressed in a vest, and he looks the part of a wise old diplomat who dressed and acts like a responsible man. And it's very different. It's a very different visual experience for America, and it helps to legitimate some of the criticisms of the Vietnam War, and it's a very important moment for him. My grandfather pushes his way back up, becomes Deputy Secretary of Defense, wants to stay on in the Nixon administration, but he's alienated William Fulbright. There's a hysterical memo I found where it's from Fulbright talking about whether it's Melvin Laird told me about it, and then I found it in the Fulbright archives. And Laird wanted to make my grandfather ambassador to Germany, and there's a memo, and Fulbright says, Mr. Nitze is an imperialist at heart. I don't think he would be a good ambassador to Germany. He might be a good ambassador to Mali. So my grandfather doesn't get that, and he is put on the eventually works his way to the SALT delegation. I'm going to read another passage here. This is about the beginning of the 1970s. The 1970s were the decade when everyone in Washington learned the fateful acronyms. Our silos were stocked with ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They were armed with MIRVs, multiple independable targetable reentry vehicles. The Soviets attacked. Our best bet would be counter with SLBMs, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and maybe we could one day stop them with an anti-ballistic missile, ABM, system. Nitze had helped coin the new vocabulary, and now he would master it. He studied the weapons the way a monk studies scripture. Every word and every weapon had meaning. World peace hinged on a stable relationship between U.S. and Soviet arsenals, and that stability could hinge on apparently tiny details. If Moscow were allowed to build just a few more of these, with those components, and we did not counter with this, the Soviets might be tempted to start a war. He began his reflection on the balance of atomic weaponry in Hiroshima with the Strategic Bombing Survey, and he had continued them since. Both at the beginning and at the end of the decade, he knew more about nuclear weapons than almost any other man alive. Nitze's fascinated immersion was matched by Kennan's willfully uncomprehending alienation. To him, the acronyms and details were preposterous. What could 1 or 20 or 100 more of these horrors possibly mean if we already had enough to turn the planet into Venus? In one sense, the stockpiles were all too real. In another sense, they were imaginary. For by tinkering with numbers and fretting over ratios, we created an illusion of control. The truth was that we had built something far too powerful for us to manage. Kennan did not reach back to Hiroshima. He reached back to his trip to Hamburg after World War II, when he concluded that no rational man could any longer countenance war on a grand scale, even with non-nuclear weapons. These two men reached these opposed conclusions through temperament and experience. Nitze had spent his youth building home telephone sets. Kennan had quietly written poetry. Nitze came to trust and believe in the power of numbers, whether in the form of Clarence Dillon's financial charts or Albert Speer's list of ball bearing factories. Kennan believed that technology destroyed more than it created. Nitze spent his life gaining confidence. He was unusually popular, generally the smartest man in the room, and always well off. From the death of his mother soon after birth, Kennan spent his life learning doubt, self-doubt, as well as doubt in the wisdom of the men making decisions for the world. Nitze's career had led him to believe that the U.S. government, especially when he was involved, could make sound decisions. Kennan felt that the U.S. government was all too likely to go astray. Nitze believed he could answer the new epic questions. Kennan believed that nobody could, and that the ghastly weapons were now in the saddle and riding mankind. The two men had agreed on a great deal in the previous 20 years, but by the end of the 1970s, when nuclear weapons haunted every element of American foreign policy, Nitze and Kennan seemed to agree on nothing. Now they truly became the hawk and the dove. So this is the beginning of, or not the beginning, but this is the moment where they're most opposed and where they're running counter organizations, and where Kennan is writing these wonderful essays about why we need to stop the arms race. And Nitze believes that if you want peace, prepare for war, and Kennan believes if you want war, prepare for war. And they have completely different views, but they also, at the same time, they maintain their respect. And I want to read a letter that gets across this respect, and I think is at a very important moment. So, my grandfather works for the Nixon administration, but eventually sort of tires of it, and he's working for Ford, and he resigns in protest. One of my favorite facts about my grandfather is that he worked for every president from Roosevelt to Bush, but he was fired or demoted at different points in the Roosevelt administration: Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, Ford, Carter, and Bush. So 8 out of 10. And every time he's fired and knocked down, he gets back up. Well, actually, there's a two-step process. Every time he's fired and knocked down, he immediately tries to get retribution and undermine whoever just fired him, and then he gets himself back up. I remember when I He was 83 years old when he was pushed out of the Bush administration, and I found these, I think wonderful documents of, these notes of these off-the-record conversations he's given trashing James Baker, who he believed was responsible for him being demoted. The day after he left the Bush administration, leaks a story that becomes a front-page story about some error in arms control negotiations. That was the way my grandfather operated, just the way he was, and his resilience is unbelievable. So one of these firings comes during the Carter administration. He's always wanted to be Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State. The great failure of his life was that he was never made into the cabinet. So 76, he's 69 years old. Thinks it's kind of the end of his, his last shot. He's tired of the Ford administration, so he needs to pick a Democrat. So he, studies them, decides that Carter is the one, A, most likely to get elected, and B, the one he could have the most influence on. So he sends him a check, puts a bumper sticker on his car very early, is brought into the Carter circle, and advises the campaign. Summer of 76, Carter calls down 8 top advisors, 4 old men, 4 young men and women. They says, I want you to come to Plains and tell me about foreign policy. And they all sit in a circle. What should I do? And the other 7, they say, well, Mr. Carter, your ideas are great. Here's a few more suggestions. My grandfather, pulls out a spreadsheet and says, you actually have everything wrong, and lectures the candidate about what he should be doing. So it's not the wisest move, as it then turns out. The other 7 are given some of the top jobs in the administration. 1 man is left out. Funny side note, my editor is Jimmy Carter's editor, and he gave my book to Carter a couple weeks ago, and Carter came back the next day and had just read the chapter on the 70s, which reveals some leaking and shenanigans that Nitze had done that nobody knows about. And Carter says, Paul Nitze always was a horse's ass. But so my grandfather, as is his wont, responds to being denied. Harold Brown actually tries to bring my grandfather in as a third-tier aide in the Defense Department, and Carter says, no, I don't want this man anywhere in my administration. So what Nitze thought was his great chance turns into a great failure. So the way he responds is to form the Committee on the Present Danger, or really bump up the Committee on the Present Danger, attacking Carter's arms control policies. Paul Warnke, an old friend of my grandfather, is nominated to run ACTA and to be the chief SALT II negotiator. My grandfather desperately works to undermine him. And there are Senate hearings for Warnke's confirmation. And this is a moment where my grandfather doesn't behave well. He normally behaves extraordinarily well, but he gets too personal, attacking Warnke. He's too upset. And he's asked by senators, sort of backed into an intellectual corner, and a senator from New Hampshire says, do you think that you're a better American than Paul Warnke? And my grandfather says, I really do. And that's not something a man like Paul Nitze would say at a Senate hearing. And so his friends are just horrified. He loses the respect of Georgetown. And they've gone through his letters, and it's a very dark period, and he feels just terrible. What have I done? I interviewed lots of people who said, I loved your grandfather. I worked closely with him. I do not understand what happened with Paul Warnke. But in those letters, I also found this short one from right after those hearings. Dear Paul, we have our differences of outlook, which is not surprising. But I am sure that I have never questioned your complete sincerity and intellectual integrity, and that no differences of this nature affect in slightest degree the confidence and affection I feel towards you as a friend. It's a very sweet, sharp, smart letter at the lowest moment of my grandfather's career, and I think it's indicative of the respect that the 2 men held for each other. Okay, so the Reagan administration comes, and Paul Nitze has been the great, the man who has said we need to build nuclear weapons is put in charge of arms control. And to the left, this is a horrible appointment. Asking Paul Nitze to control arms is like putting the Pope in charge of abortion rights, and there's all this outrage. But the people on the right recognize that actually if you put Paul Nitze on the inside and put him in charge of arms control, he will control arms. Richard Pearl dismisses him as he's an inveterate problem solver. And he comes in and he really does try to solve problems, and he becomes the man who works the hardest inside of the Reagan administration to bring about these arms deals. And so there's an interesting parallelism. Kennan in the beginning of the Reagan administration is giving these wonderful speeches about why we need a 50% reduction in nuclear weapons, and Nitze on the inside is quietly pushing the same idea. And they're, despite their different reputations, they're actually working in parallel here. My grandfather, during the INF talks, he decides he's frustrated with the American policy, so he takes his Soviet counterpart and says, let's just do this. Let's just figure it out. And they go and they walk out into the woods, and they sit on a log with the rain dripping down, and they come up with an agreement, and they bring it back and say, we've solved it, these problems that no one has been able to solve. Here's the deal. And of course, it's crushed by the bureaucracies in the U.S. and crushed by the bureaucracy in the Soviet Union. But my grandfather is actively trying, and then comes Reykjavik, and this is the apex of my grandfather's career. And, he stays up all night negotiating with Marshal Akhromeyev. And they get close. He's, goes from 10 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning. And they solve problems and they get deals. At 7 o'clock in the morning comes, he races over to George Shultz, wakes him up. Shultz is in his pajamas. Look at what we've done. Shultz says, my God, that's good. My grandfather says, this is the most fun I've had in years. And they get close the next day. The Americans are meeting in a private place. They sit in the bathroom because it's the only place in the house they're in where they can have some privacy. And Reagan sits on the toilet and they start talking. What should we do? Should we sign this ultimate deal? And the question comes down to how much will the United States yield on missile defense? Will we agree to limit our testing in a laboratory to 5 years? Or will we insist that we, have a 10-year window? Nitze says, just sign it, do it. Nitze kind of knows that missile defense isn't really going to work, and it's a chip that should be traded, and now is the time to trade it. Pearl and counseling the other side, and then, Pearl's argument wins. Reagan decides not, both Reagan and Gorbachev decide they don't want the deal, and the talks end. So the 79-year-old man spent his whole life working on nuclear weapons, stays up all night. His wife is at home dying. He's, put everything into this, and he just misses. And so my favorite photograph in the book is a picture from Reykjavik of Reagan sitting there with Edelman and all the other top advisors and my grandfather's, just exhausted and beaten. And he gives a press conference and he says, we tried. He starts to cry. We almost got it. And he thinks that's sort of the last act. But of course, as we all know, it doesn't actually matter that much. The failure at Reykjavik turns out to be, not the most important thing happening because while that's going on, the Soviet Union is imploding. So, 2 years later, 5 years later, the Soviet Union is gone. And Nitze and Kennan are both hailed. And it's a great moment for both of them. Kennan is considered the man who came up with the policy of containment, the man who set America on the right road. Nitze is the man who implemented it. He's asked by Jim Lehrer, why did we win the Cold War? He responds, well, we won the Cold War because Kennan came up with the right ideas and I made them practical. So they're both hailed, and I want to read, the last thing I want to read is to read the end of the book. In late September 2001, I visited my grandfather's home in Georgetown. As he often did, he sat in his study, leaning back deeply in an oversized easy chair. A cane rested by his side. Books were stacked on a table next to a small silver bowl of nuts and a glass of red wine. He walked slowly. He'd grown a light, scratchy beard. He talked infrequently and with great effort. I would often come just to sit near him and keep him company. Sometimes I would read to him. This day he started by saying how shaken he had been by the terrorist attacks on the Pentagon and the World Trade Center. I nodded and told him I agreed. After waiting for a bit, I asked a question. I looked over his bookshelf and I noticed the complete works of Conrad, each conspicuously worn. I was a little taken aback. How, Gramps, did you have time to read all these books when you were negotiating the arms treaties? Missiles are boring, he replied deliberately. Conrad is interesting. He then began to reflect a bit over his life. Again, he paused for a second. Sometimes I think I've had so much more luck than I deserve. That evening, I wrote down another nugget of wisdom he passed on that day. I keep going because I still find it interesting. 3 years later, in the summer of 2004, we had our last conversation. I came by to tell him of my engagement and plans for a wedding that I knew he was far too frail to attend. Is she kind, he asked. Yes, I replied. He came back with the last sentence he ever said to me. Tell me about her. On October 19, 2004, he let go his grip on life. Kennan gave one final public interview in 2002, when he was 98, warning that the United States should not rush into Iraq. War has a momentum of its own, and it carries you away from all thoughtful intentions when you get into it. Today, if we went into Iraq like the president would like us to do, you know where you begin. You never know where you're going to end. His body was frail, though, and he knew it was time to tie up his most important loose end. One day he put on his coat and tie and told his nurse, Betsy Barrett, that he wanted to pray for his mother, who he said had died knowing that she would never know her son. He went to his church and spent 15 minutes on his knees. He never mentioned her again. Kennan was determined to be alert for his 100th birthday. As the day neared, he tried to stay sharp by folding little pieces of paper and trying to keep track of them. But he knew he was losing control of his mind, just as his wife of more than 70 years had. Annalise was a sound body, but she could no longer remember what she had done during the day. One of the last things Barrett remembers is Kennan tenderly looking at Annalise, who he knew could no longer understand him. He wished, he said, that we could go down the steps and out through the door together. He died at age 101 on March 17, 2005, just 149 days after the death of his lifelong rival and friend. So that's the book, and I'm delighted to take questions.
Thank you. Okay, why don't we open the floor up? We'll go to Thomas. We have Dimitri also. Thomas?
Excuse me. My name's Thomas Grindley. A month or two after the famous Kennan telegram. Winston Churchill gave his speech to the joint houses of Congress and his Iron Curtain speech at Fulton. Do you know if Churchill had read the telegram when he was preparing his speeches?
I don't know the answer to that question. I would assume that he had, because there's evidence that almost everybody read the telegram, including it got very quickly to the KGB. My instinct is that he probably did, but I can't be certain. What is also important and what is attached to that question is, how much did the telegram really matter? If it hadn't been for Kennan, weren't enough people pushing the idea that Stalin was no longer an ally? And there's no doubt, Kennan has a wonderful line in his, I believe it's in his memoirs or it's in a letter to somebody, where he says, if I had written this memo 6 months earlier, or 3 months earlier, no one would have listened. If I had given it 6 months later, it would have been perceived wisdom. And so Kennan clearly understood that he had just gotten the timing exactly right. And it's also true that other people were pushing this. But I also think there was something important for American Cold War policy, that the first document to really be circulated and to lay out the critique of the Soviet Union was written by someone with real historical knowledge, someone who truly understood the country, who understood where this came from, and who understood how one could respond. And I think we're very fortunate that it was Kennan's long telegram and Kennan's X article that were the foundational documents of American strategy, and not other people writing on the same topic or in the same way.
Actually, that leads me to the question I wanted to ask, and then we'll go back to the floor. This is a great story. The book is a great read, and clearly both Nitze and Kennan are powerful personalities. But in a certain extent, they occupied positions that logically had to be filled.
Yeah.
So how much at the end of the day do you think they themselves as human beings are really important to the story, and how much of this is they happen in different ways to be in the right place at the right time?
That is a very hard question, and an important one. I think, part of the answer is that Kennan, in a way, is more indispensable because he's so original. There's no one else who writes like Kennan, thinks like Kennan, talks like Kennan. So in that respect, he's more indispensable. But he has very little influence on policy after 1949. So the Cold War, probably without him, would have continued in similar fashions. Nitze is a bureaucrat who could have been replaced, and somebody else could have made his arguments and implemented, could have been Secretary of the Navy from 63 to 67 and could have reformed the Navy in slightly different ways. There are a couple of things that I think Nitze is responsible for two very specific things. One, SALT II would have passed without my grandfather. I'm very confident of that. He was the most important critic. He's responsible in sort of secret ways for leaking information about the so-called Cuban Brigade in the summer of 1979 that is the head SALT negotiator told me is the banana peel that tripped up the talks. So he's the intellectual argument against it, and then sort of a lot of the political maneuvering at the end. That, of course, leaves the question, if SALT II is passed by the Senate, how does that affect the rest of the Cold War? And you can play that out in 100 ways. I asked, I went to Moscow and interviewed the General Datinov, the equivalent of the Deputy Secretary of Defense, and he said, well, if SALT II had been signed, we wouldn't have gone into Afghanistan. Okay, well, that's true, and except that, if they didn't go into Afghanistan, then they may not have actually decayed as quickly, so maybe that's a bad thing, but then we wouldn't have the Afghanistan war. I mean, it's very hard to play all these things out, but I think you give my grandfather credit for that. And I also think that my grandfather's efforts at arms control in the Reagan administration helped create the environment or helped give Gorbachev some sense of the confidence he had that he could go forward in a similar way that Reagan did. I mean, there's no question that the person, in my mind, there's no question that the person who is most indispensable to the way the Cold War happens is Gorbachev. It could have been somebody else, and then events would have been extraordinarily different. You can't say that as much of Nitze or Kennan, though they do get credit for certain specific things, certain specific ideas, and certain specific actions.
Okay. I'm going to take two questions, and we'll be quick, Dmitry and then Wayne, and then we'll go back out.
My name is Dmitry Novik. I was in Soviet Union when you describe the day of winter of 1945. It was 2 days celebration. I participated in two of them. Even I was 13 years old schoolboy. First one was May 8th, before U.S. Embassy on Manege Plaza. It was not organized event, of course, but it was maybe 8 or 10,000 people before embassy. It was not organized, completely enthusiastic celebration. The next day was official celebration. It's how the Cold War maybe started. My question is this. Sorry that I put my memory, but my question is, with hindsight, who is right? Both men right? It's impossible to be right on opposite direction. What's your opinion? Who is right or more right?
Okay.
Like to say.
And why don't we take Wayne's question too?
Thank you. Wayne Mary. George Kennan's writings are probably much more, not so much controversial in his writings about Russia, but his writings about America.
Yeah.
Writings which are frequently very nostalgic, rather conservative, some people might even regard as reactionary. To what extent was Nitze, whose public image was as of the Mandarin class, the East Coast intellectual, sort of Ivy League class, to what extent did his views about America parallel, diverge from those of Kennan?
Wow, these are a series of great questions. I wish I had interviewed you. I tried desperately to find people who had been in Red Square on that day. Who was more right? That is a question I struggled with throughout, and what I don't have an answer. I mean, there were reviews. There was a review in the Washington Times that said, this is a wonderful book because it proves that Nitze was right. Sort of the same day, there was a review in The Economist that this is a wonderful book because it, shows how much, shows Kennan's importance, whereas Nitze is not nearly as important. Ultimately, I decided that they play very different roles. Kennan is a visionary. He is right about how the Cold War should be carried out. Absolutely, he sees the way events will unfold. He sees what will happen to the Soviet Union. He sees small things. He sees large things. He sees. I interviewed Henry Kissinger, and he told me that Kennan had come into his office in 1969 and said, "It seems like you're on the verge of opening relations with China." I've been looking at the way you've been dealing with exchange rates in Taiwan, and there's only one possible explanation, that about a year from now you plan to do this. So Kennan is utterly brilliant in foreseeing things like that. He's a master visionary, which Nitze is not. But Nitze is the pragmatist. Nitze is the man who actually, he changes policies days to day, and he does ultimately change many more policies in a conflict that we ultimately will say was successful. So in that sense, Nitze is more right. In the first sense, Kennan is more right in that he foresees things. So it's I can't give you a one or the other. You're absolutely right that Kennan's views of America are controversial, complicated, and quite negative. He wants, of much of America, he wanted diary entries where he wants to, get rid of California and Florida because of the Latin American fringe is, upsetting our capacity to think through complicated issues. And there's a deep pessimism about where this country is headed and what it's doing. And my grandfather had none of that. He had the same circle of friends. It wasn't as though he was, was down in Miami meeting with people trying to understand how immigration was improving the country. But he had none of the pessimism about the changes. He had this constant sunny sense that America is the greatest nation on earth. It will continue to be the greatest nation on earth. I am so proud to be an American. So it was a very, very different way of looking at the people around them.
Okay, Sam, and then we'll come on this side.
Sam Wells here at the Wilson Center. Let me compliment you on your book. It's an excellent read and a masterpiece of research, which only one who has been through many of the same records can fully appreciate. I agree with you that the greatest accomplishment of your grandfather was the arms control negotiations during the Reagan administration. And I wonder, from your research, can you say how frequent the contact was between Nitze and Reagan, and when Nitze first came to appreciate that, in Strobe Talbot's phrase, Reagan was a nuclear abolitionist?
Okay. Why don't we take the gentleman in the back? You can answer, and then we'll come back to Cole.
Bob Schadler. My question is in somewhat similar vein. In the early Reagan years, there were massive protests in Europe, pretty much throughout Europe, against the Pershing IIs and land-based cruise missiles. And Nitze seemed to be particularly concerned about the effects of that, and much of his policy orientation was with that as a backdrop. Do you know what specifically he was concerned about? Helmut Schmidt had lost office. Was he concerned about pro-INF politicians losing office? Or did he go as far as thinking that might push West Germany out of NATO? Could you just elaborate on what his policy-related concerns were given the INF protests?
Sure. I don't know when or even whether my grandfather ever appreciated Reagan's, whether he appreciated the sincerity of Reagan's nuclear abolition, which we now know from the Reagan diaries. My grandfather was not that close with Reagan. I mean, there were very few people who were. My grandfather was on the outside. Reagan, appreciated my grandfather, and but they didn't. They didn't talk. They had very different views of communicating. My grandfather is, Mr. Hyperlogical. A follows B follows C follows D follows E. There's a wonderful description of someone being in a meeting where my grandfather is talking about certain kinds of SLBMs and why we need them and why we don't need them and why we don't need these other kind. And he says, and you could tell that Ronald Reagan was on horseback, thinking that the man in front of him was describing two different types of spinach. But he did. I mean, there's something interesting about my grandfather is that the two presidents he ended up saying he liked the most were Reagan and Truman, and I think he got the sense that they both. What he did appreciate was he appreciated the other side of Reagan, the kind we knew more then, not the kind that's been written about by historians, which is the evil empire. Right after Reagan gives his evil empire speech, there's a Q&A, and somebody says, how on earth can the president say something like this? Want to alienate the Soviets? And my grandfather says, has it ever occurred to you that maybe it's right that they are an evil empire? And so I think he was closer to Reagan on that front. I don't think he knew about the abolition, or I'm sure it came up in sort of context in Reykjavik, but I don't think that was a major part of the way he thought about Reagan. INF. He went to Germany in May and June of '82, and he saw some of the protests, and he knew about some of the protests, and I think he thought that anti-INF politicians were going to come in, and I think he thought that there was going to be. I don't think he thought that Germany would leave NATO. I think he thought that there would be fighting within NATO and the Atlantic Alliance would start to fray, and that he was very aware, or he had a sense that the reason the Vietnam policy had fallen apart was that we had lost the support of the American people. And I think he thought that the countries of Western Europe were going to lose the support of their people, things were going to change, and we would no longer be able to work with them the way we had for so long. And that's where the Walk in the Woods comes from. The Walk in the Woods is July of '82. This is after he's come back from Germany, and he said, my God, this is coming off the rails. We need to do something now. We need to solve this problem. The specter of American Pershing missiles coming into Germany and England has created such popular protest and such chaos. We need a treaty. We need to solve this. And that's why he went off on his freelance assignment, which one person I interviewed said it was the greatest disregard for negotiating orders in the history of America.
Okay, Cole Blazier, and then the gentleman in the back, and that'll probably wrap up. Cole, here's a microphone.
I had the privilege of knowing both men briefly, and I liked them both. I tended to follow Kennan more than Nitze, but they had strange aspects of their personality, which had some significance for the reasons of the problems they had in life. When I met with Nitze a number of times, I hate to say this, but I had not heard a fouler mouth since I was in the Navy in World War II. And, it was no reason for it. I mean, we didn't have to, but it was interesting. And I think there's probably some explanation of that may relate to his policy stances. I don't know. And then for George Kennan, he was always so elegant, as you say, had a bow tie, all that sort of thing. But how could a Foreign Service officer coming back from his post, take off against the Russians like he did in Berlin? I mean, it's just unbelievable. That is against everything we learn in the Foreign Service. He made some other mistakes too. I mean, he went to Belgrade, and you see, professors would understand this, but why would he do it? He organized the staff, recruited the staff against their will, or not against their will, they had to do it really, but to write chapters for a book, about Yugoslavia. I mean, these are weird behaviors. I'd be interested in your comment on them if you have any.
Okay, and then the last row will be the last question.
Hello, my name is Garrett Martin. I had the chance to teach the history of the Cold War here in Washington, and the sobering moment realizing most of my students were not born when the Berlin Wall was still up. So, in some respects, for them it was an interesting story, the Cold War, but it was a bit like the Romans and the Greeks. It's ancient history. And I was always trying to get them to think about what is, the lessons learned, the relevance of this story. And I'm wondering if you had the same thought, since the book is mostly about the Cold War, a little bit about what happened after. So what would you think would be the relevance of these two characters for the contemporary challenges that the United States faces?
That's a great question. Okay, so question number one. My grandfather, I never heard my grandfather's foul mouth, but that's probably because I was 7 years old. And I wonder what in what context it was. It wasn't something that was said regularly about him. But he was an extraordinarily intense man, and I can see him if he got on a certain line of thought, he would be taking notes and just drive the pencil through the paper. And he would have conversations that would last all night and get very angry and red faced. So there's absolutely that. Kennan's mistakes. Kennan, as one of his deputies in Yugoslavia, Lawrence Eagleberger, said in an interview, he said he was a better writer than he was an ambassador. Kennan, he was such an individual and such an original. He had a very hard time operating within the rules and constraints of whatever position he was in. And when he was ambassador to Moscow, he gave a press conference where he said that, somebody said, "What's it like being an ambassador?" He said, "Well, it's like being interned during World War II." For which he was declared persona non grata, and that was the end of the diplomatic posting that he'd had high aspirations for. And in Yugoslavia, he makes a whole series of errors. He comes back and he's supposed to, convince Congress to extend most favored nation trading status to Yugoslavia. And so, one of the things he does is he writes a letter to the editor of the New York Times in which he describes the appalling ignorance of Congress and how they don't understand this issue. Now, if you want to get Congress to vote in your favor, you don't describe their appalling ignorance. He couldn't help himself. He in some ways he was just too brilliant for the positions and too brilliant, awkward, unable to work with the people around him. So that's why he made those mistakes, and ultimately why he didn't have the influence that he could have had. The lessons for today. I deliberately tried to make this very much a story of the Cold War from 1945 to 1989 because I wanted it to. The issues of the day change constantly, right? So you don't want a book that is a template for how we deal with Afghanistan and Iraq today, because then the book becomes dated, and 10 years from now that part of the book is irrelevant. But there are certainly things that are important. You can take Kennan's ideas and you can apply them to our conflicts today. The idea of containment, right? So how does containment, combine containment and realism? How do you apply them to Afghanistan? And I think there's a pretty clear argument that Kennan's position on Afghanistan would be, we should be trying to limit the threat of al-Qaeda to the extent we can break up those terrorist networks, absolutely. But we should not be trying to rebuild that country. And we should not be working with the Karzai government. We should have extremely limited aims there. In Iraq, absolutely. We should, this is, as he said in his final interview of his life, we do not need to go into this country, overthrow it, topple it, and then try to rebuild it. Not only, it will create forces that we don't understand, and we will fail. And that is, so if you look at the life of George Kennan and you look at his writings, you have lessons and arguments about how America should act. Now, you can agree or disagree with them, but you certainly have clear lessons. And one lesson of the Cold War is that containment does ultimately work. Kennan didn't believe that his ideas of containment were applied, but in the one big test case, we never did invade the Soviet Union. We never did, try to push them out of Eastern Europe, and eventually we did win. Now, things could have gone wrong. There are lots of moments we went haywire. We made lots of mistakes. We wasted lots of money. We could debate this for the next 6 hours, but there's certainly something you can draw from that. From my grandfather's life, there's not a central lesson or a central political philosophy that you can take forward besides, absolute expertise in the issue and really understand what things should have been done. I've been sometimes tried to think about the initial invasion of Iraq and would my grandfather have supported it? And he is the man who brought Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl to Washington, and Jim Woolsey, three of the people who were very important in the early Iraq operation. Would he have sided with them? And I don't know. But one thing that he absolutely would have believed is he would have been extraordinarily frustrated by the stories of the errors and the technical errors and the mismanagement errors. My grandfather was someone who cared intensely about the details and immensely about the details. And so that is a lesson. If you look at his negotiating record, that is a lesson for how politics should be carried out, not just big picture stuff, but really getting the right people to do the right things and talk about them in the right ways. And then, the lesson from my grandfather's life that I think is most applicable is how you recover, how you pick yourself back up when you're knocked down, which he did extraordinarily well. I got an email the other day, which I think kind of partially answers that question, but it was from somebody who said, "Dear Nick, I read your book, beginning to end. I want to live like Nitze and write like Kennan." So, there you go.
Well, I said in the beginning, and hopefully in an hour you would know why you have to buy the book, and I think now you know. So it's outside, and I'm sure you'll sign copies if people purchase them. Nick, thank you very much.
Thank you. It was great to be here. Thank you all for